Alright guys, welcome back. We're going to be looking at blue cards this time. I am in draft very often a blue player. If blue's open, I'm happy to go into it most of the time. Very rarely is blue a bad choice in a format just because it is the color of tempo plays and combat tricks and interesting interactions, draw spells, stuff like that, unblockable creatures, evasive threats, so on and so forth. It just has so much going for it most of the time. Here we get Surge in addition to everything else that blue does, and I think if you watched my red video that I'm pretty excited for Surge. I'm looking forward to opening it up in some sealed pool. Surge is also just great for two-headed giant, so I imagine you're going to see a lot of red-blue at two-headed giant just because of how efficient the cards are when your opponent's casting a spell and then suddenly you're surging things. So just as an example, we can look at the very first cards, and I think at least the first three cards here all have Surge, so pretty good examples right off the bat. Dwar Isle Avenger is on the surface a 5-mana 3/3 flyer, which is fine. We're not super excited about that. Of course, we're excited about casting this for 3 mana. So this doesn't do anything extra when you do cast it for Surge, but you're getting a 3/3 for 3 in the best case scenario. We saw cards like Bonesaw and Expedite in red in the colorless that can let you cast this. In the best case scenario, you have Bonesaw, which lets you cast this on turn 3, which is very, very good. And that puts a big sizable fly-in threat that your opponent's going to have to deal with or take probably a big chunk of damage from before they can do anything about it, just because that's so ahead of the curve. If you have to play this on turn 5 because, for example, you can't get a spell and surge this in the same turn, then that's fine. This will still be a threat when it comes down, something that your opponent's going to have to deal with later on, or at least something that can trade off for a flyer that's on the board. So very, very powerful for 3 mana, and still playable for 5. The next one, this is a 4-mana instant that lets target player draw 2 cards. Now the target player is relevant, especially in two-headed giant, because you can target your teammate. If you are down on, or if your teammate's down on cards, you can let them draw 2 cards with this. Very rarely do I see you target an opponent with this, but it's still an option there. If, for instance, the game's gone long and they only have a couple cards left in their deck, then, you know, that's going to come up at least once in all the games of Oath that's going to be played. But really, you want to be surging this as well, and that works, of course, better in two-headed giant, but is still very doable in 1v1. Surge cost is 3 here again, which is an instant speed divination. Divination's actually just fine at sorcery speed, but when you can instant speed it, that's great. 3 mana to draw 2 cards at instant speed would be wonderful, and at 4 mana it's not bad. We saw Weave Fate in Khans of Tarkir, which was 4 mana instant, draw 2 cards, and that was playable, but a little clunky. This is clunky at 4, but still playable. You don't want too many copies of cards like this, but 1 is just fine, and if you can surge it, it's actually a pretty great card. The next Surge card we get is Containment Membrane. This is a 3-mana enchantment, a pretty typical effect for things like this. The enchanted creature does not untap during its controller's untap step. We can Surge it for 1, which is pretty good. It lets you pretty much get it works the opposite of some of the other Surge cards. This lets you cast something a little more expensive first and then get a cheap spell afterwards, whereas most Surge cards look like you cast the cheap thing first and then you get the more expensive card afterwards. This kind of works in the reverse, but this is the type of card that you'd be fine casting on 3 anyway. It kind of locks down a creature that's, granted that creature has to have already attacked or be tapped somehow. This does not automatically tap it like Claustrophobia or something like that. But it is basically creature removal for blue on a creature that's already tapped, and that sort of effect is just fine. I like the idea of being able to surge this for 1. It makes it pretty efficient while not making it impossible to cast other spells during the same turn. Negate's back. Alright, we're going to go back for a second, actually. So there's a big debate about whether Negate is playable in Limited or not, and actually not a big debate. I guess the consensus is that Negate is better in Sealed than it is in Draft, which I definitely agree with. People are going to have more powerful spells and more of them in Sealed. Negate does fine of getting rid of that. You're going to see more Planeswalkers in Sealed than you will in Draft, so Negate is there. I am of the opinion that Negate is a main deckable card in almost every format, just as a precautionary card against blowout, instant, sorceries, combat tricks, stuff like that. I am fine playing 1 Negate in the main board, but it's usually a 23rd playable. I will cut it if I have better cards. In Draft, I'm a little less excited about it, but I still think it's main boardable, just not the best thing in the world. Negate will save you, and a lot of times games come down to when you're the one casting the spell and your opponent has 2 open mana, it comes down to whether your opponent has the negate or not, and oftentimes you will get blown out by a negate, or you will just play into it because you don't suspect people have it. Negate's a little bit controversial, and we see it so often. I think in Standard right now there's 4 or 5 different copies of Negate that are legal, but there you go, Negate's back. At least we get new art for it. Again, what else can you say about it, right? Alright, Sweep Away is an instant that returns target creature to its owner's hand. Pretty standard. Has an additional clause that says if that creature is attacking, you can put it on the top of its owner's library instead. Now, Whisk Away looks very similar. Of course, Whisk Away is a little bit different because it has the blocking clause on it. But Sweep Away seems really good in a format that's going to still have ingest cards. We see that with things like Royal Spout. Royal Spout lets you throw a creature back on top of the opponent's library, and then you can attack with something like Mist Intruder or Benthic Infiltrator to exile that card, making it permanent removal instead of just temporary removal. I like the base card just fine, bouncing something for 3 mana at instant speed, even though that sort of effect is usually 2 mana, and it's much better at 2. But I think if you're using this as a combat trick to get rid of an attacker, it's quite good, and I'd be very happy to play multiple copies of this. Alright, we get kind of a blue aggressive creature here. We usually get 1 or 2 of these per set. This is a 2 mana 2/1 with prowess, and that's about it. It's called Marit Entangler, which kind of the Entangler leads me to believe that it would do something else, but it doesn't. It's just a beater. Sometimes if you're really, I think this really shines in the Surge deck. Obviously that's going to be the type of deck that has a pretty even concentration of creatures and non-creature spells, so this should be able to get fairly big. I can imagine turns where you play this on turn 2 and then turn 3 you're able to cast 2 spells and you're suddenly attacking for 4 damage. This kind of card does drop off later in the game where it's not as relevant or it just gets eaten up, but also worth noting that it is an ally. Blue does have, a sparse number of allies here and there, even though most of the creatures are devoid Eldrazi and stuff like that, but I think this card's fine. I don't know what home it's going to have, what kind of aggressive strategies there are, but I imagine Blue-Red Surge is able to support this card and make it quite worth its while. 3 mana here for Cultivator Drone. This is a 2/3 with Devoid, taps for colorless mana. The stipulation is that you can only use that mana for colorless stuff, whether you're casting a colorless spell, you're using a colorless permanence ability, or you're paying a colorless cost. That's just fine. That's what you're going to be doing with that colorless mana anyway. Basically, this just means that you can't use this colorless mana to cast like a big white creature or something like that. If it has Devoid, then you can use this ability to cast it, because Devoid means that card has no color. So this is going to be ramp in blue for most cards, which is actually pretty interesting. Blue doesn't normally get effects like this, or if they do, they're a lot more specific. This is the type of card that in Draft and Sealed, it works with a synergistic deck very, very well. There are tons of cards that we've already seen that need this colorless symbol, or this colorless mana, and Cultivator Drone, I think, is a fine pick. The stats are decent here, too. It's not just a completely dead, 1/1 that fixes your colorless mana. I think this is a fine card. If you need the colorless mana, pick up one of these. If you don't need the colorless mana, then you don't really need this card. Alright, Blinding Drone, being kind of an obvious nod to Blinding Soul Eater. Here we have a 2 mana 1/3. For colorless mana, you can tap Blinding Drone to tap target creature. Very similar to Blinding Soul Eater, which had a very similar effect. The card overall costing 1 more and not being a specific color, whereas you could use Phyrexian mana or white mana for the tap effect. This is the type of card that, even though the comparisons are very, very similar, I don't think you can compare the cards quite as evenly, just because Modern Masters 2015 was such a diverse and unique synergistic set that the applications of Soul Eater are going to be a lot different than the Blinding Drone. Obviously, you're using this as a tapper, and this is a decent tapper. It's not overly expensive. It's much better than the white tapper we saw with Cohort, and it's a fine blocker. It also slots into a powerful Devoid deck, so this guy does enough to justify playing him, I think, and kind of fits the role of something like a big wall much better, as tapping a creature down is better than blocking it for a little while, in my opinion. So Blinding Drone is a card that, even though I normally try not to play them, I'm fine having one of them in my deck. Alright, Abstruse Interference. 3-mana instant devoid spell. Another counter spell here. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. You get a Eldrazi Scion. Of course, you can use that Scion to sack for colorless mana. Now, this is actually one of the most unexciting commons I see here. We already have Spell Shrivel, which is the same exact cost, but counters the spell unless your opponent pays 4. Obviously, that's much more potent, and turns out Spell Shrivel actually was just a straight-up counter spell in most situations. This one's a lot easier to get around, as that 1 mana is just going to be floating around on Scions and stuff like that. And this is really the type of counterspell that's good if you're on the play, where you're ahead on mana and your opponent's playing a tap-out plan. But I don't think the Scion you get off of this really justifies it. If, however, you are certain you're going to counter something with this, it's decent. A counter spell that also gives you some sort of extra bonus is fine, but I think this is enough worse than the other counter spells that we already have in this format that I'm not looking to pick it up, let alone play it in my draft deck. Gravity Negator. This is 4 mana, another devoid flyer. Most of them are going to be devoid, and this one does have flying for a 2/3, which is fine. We saw a nice mix of 2/3 and 3/2 flyers already in the format, so I imagine the flyer deck is still going to be a thing, as it usually is. This guy gets a little spicy here, though. Whenever Gravity Negator attacks, you can pay colorless. If you do, another target creature gains flying until end of turn. That's pretty interesting in my opinion. It lets you pick up one of your ground creatures and just throw it in the air, so you're getting over your opponent. Not only are you attacking with a efficient flyer here, but you're sending another creature and you're just pushing in a lot of damage. This does cost colorless, but that seems fine. I don't think there should be any problem using colorless costs, as I've said plenty of times. And it is a very corner case situation, but there are times when you have cards like Plummet, or we saw Tears of Valakut, where you can use Gravity Negator to give your opponent's creature flying and then use something like Plummet to destroy it. Those don't happen very often, but it is a neat little thing that I have seen come up before. I can't name the exact situation, but when your opponent's creatures start gaining flying, you can use more specific sideboard cards to kind of deal with them. But I like Gravity Negator. I'm happy to have one of these. I don't think it's not good in multiples, really, unless you'd have a huge board presence, just because, honestly, if you're paying 4 mana for this card, you probably don't have tons and tons of creatures on the field. But I think I'm happy to have one of them in an aggressive blue deck, blue-white, something like that, maybe even blue-red. Alright, Slip Through Space. This is very similar to Expedite, which was the 1-red cantrip that gives a creature haste. This one's a 1-blue sorcery that makes a creature unblockable, and then you draw a card. So just like Expedite, you're drawing the card off of it. So this could be run as like a 41st card, or it's very cuttable. It doesn't do that much, but obviously the reason we're playing it at all is probably for Surge. Follow up a 1-mana spell with a Surge card, for instance, our 3-mana 3/3 Sphinx. Then you have a turn where you're making something unblockable, you're not down a card, and you get to play a 3/3 for 3, which is pretty incredible. 3/3 flyer nonetheless. Slip Through Space. This is a kind of card, because Surge is a mechanic, if you have the right kind of Surge cards in your deck, I feel like you should not cycle this that early. So don't go just jamming it on a creature to draw it unless you really need to draw a card or a land or something like that. Hold on to this type of card until you're ready to play your Surge card. That way you have the enabler ready for it. Again, though, Slip Through Space doesn't really do that much. There aren't a lot of creatures that do things on hitting, dealing combat damage in this format, but it does enough, and it's synergistic enough that you might want one of these in certain decks. Alright, Rolling Waters. This is an expensive one, but it does quite a bit. For 7 mana, sorcery speed, you can return up to 2 target creatures on your opponent's side of the field, and then target player draws 2 cards. Same thing with comparative analysis. Target player draws 2 cards means that your partner can draw 2 cards if you're playing Two-Headed Giant. This is In some situations, this sort of effect is just huge, and in other situations, it's terrible. When your opponent's just going wide and has tons and tons of creatures and you're behind, this is not always going to get you back in the game. But if your opponent's playing big fatties, or they just used all their scions to ramp something out early, this can really punish them. The fact is, it does cost 7 mana, so you don't want a ton of these. You don't want this in a deck that is trying to be really aggressive early on, but it does quite a bit for 7 mana. Huge swing in your favor. Two creatures off the field, 2 extra cards in your hand. Gift of Tusks. So we get another 1 blue spell. So another Surge enabler here. This is very reminiscent of cards like Turn to Frog or Rapid Hybridization, Ponify, stuff like that. It says, at instant speed until end of turn, target creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elephant with base power and toughness 3/3. So this is kind of... It's a little bit worse than things like Rapid Hybridization, depending on the context, because you don't get a permanent 3/3 and it doesn't remove the creature from play. But you can use this most of the times as removal. If your opponent's attacking with something and it's bigger than 3/3, this is going to shrink it. Likewise, if you're attacking with something and it's smaller than 3/3, you can use this to kind of grow it. Obviously, I think you want this card. I'm usually happy playing this type of card as a one-of, regardless of what deck, but again, this goes so much up in value with Surge that it's very, very efficient. One thing I like to point out about these type of cards is that lose all abilities clause is very relevant. If your opponent's playing something like a big flyer that you just can't deal with, this makes that creature lose flying. If you're getting beaten down by something that's unblockable, that creature loses that clause that says it's unblockable, and this kind of deals with it very, very well. So very versatile, very cheap, good combat trick, and a lot of situations you're going to use this and then follow it up with a Surge card, which I like quite a bit. Alright, Mr. Cyclone here, 5 mana flyer, 3/4. So at its base, if we're comparing this to something like the Jawar Isle Sphinx, this is already a little bit better just from the 1 power of toughness. But this guy has a pretty good effect. When this guy, Clone Sire, dies, you may put 3 counters on a land you control, and it becomes a 0/0 haste with those 3 counters. So you're essentially getting a 3/3 creature out of the deal when this dies. That's very, very efficient. It replaces itself. Of course, the land doesn't have flying unless you have Howlmar Tidecaller or something like that. But this does a lot for its mana cost. You're getting another creature in place of it. Excuse me. And this is already efficient enough. 3/4 flyer in the air for 5 is something I'm decently happy with. I think this is very good. The Awaken style ability is intriguing enough that I'm going to play it, and let's be honest, the art on this looks awesome. Moving on, we get Grip of the Royal, 3 mana instant, Surge for 2, so you get a 1 mana discount on the Surge, and then you get the same effect as Crippling Chill, if we can pronounce it correctly. So you tap a creature, that creature is frozen during your opponent's next untap step, and then you draw a card. So this is replacing it. For 2 mana, that's fantastic, and it's already playable for 3. At least Cripple and Chill was in its own format, so I'm going to go with the assumption that this is going to kind of fill the same role. Of course, these sort of effects are tempo-based, so you need to be doing something. These sort of things are better when you are attacking a lot than they are when you're just using it defensively. Think of Adverse Conditions. That's the 4 mana instant from Battle for Zendikar that taps 2 things down, freezes them, and then you get a Scion. That card is great if you plan on attacking through it. If you're just using it to buy time, then it's fine because this draws a card, but it's not doing enough to make it justify its presence in the deck. So again, if you want to be using this sort of effect, you also want to be taking advantage of the fact that your opponent's creature is not untapping, and use that to get in some damage while you can. Another interesting card with a very similar kind of thing we've seen, a Unity of Purpose. This costs 4 mana, and it does 2 things. First off, it supports 2. That means that you're going to choose up to 2 creatures that you or a partner of yours control, and you're going to put a counter on each of them, a 1/1 counter. And then this has a additional clause that you can tap each creature you control with a 1/1 counter, not just the ones you supported, but any creature you have with a 1/1 counter. This is very similar to Dragon Scale Boon, which was a combat trick that was hard to play around sometimes. Either your opponent had it or you didn't, and sometimes you couldn't afford to play around it. That was put 2 counters on one thing and untap it. This is a little more versatile than that. Of course, you can't put 2 counters on the same thing, but you can spread it out and untap with 2 creatures. This is the type of card that I think is a lot better earlier in the format when people don't really have it in mind. A lot of players won't be thinking of it, and if you leave that 4 mana open, you can really surprise somebody and blow them out of the water with a card like this. It is blue, which is a little interesting because this sort of effect usually ends up in green, but I think it's just intriguing to me. I think this is one of the cards with support that I really like. I think I'm going to draft it quite often. Moving on, we have a Devoid counter spell. This is basically cancel, actually dissipate, if you will. Counter target spell. If it's countered, exile it. So yeah, we usually get cancel type effects, or dissipate type effects, whatever you want to call it. We have them in almost every set, whether it's cancel or something similar. We already have Scatter to the Winds in Battle for Zendikar, and we already have a slew of other counter spells, including Spell Shrivel and the 1 or 2 that we've already seen in this video alone. So Void Shatter is here as another option. It is double blue, so that's usually why cancel gets cut from decks, is that cancel, or you don't want the double blue. Not always, unless you're heavy blue, you don't want to sit there and hold up 3 mana and then potentially your opponent doesn't do anything. The exile on this is relevant, just like dissipate, as in Battle for Zendikar, we still have processors, even though there aren't very many cards, or any that come to mind, that care about cards being exiled. In Oath of the Gatewatch, we still have the cards that care about Exile Zone in Battle for Zendikar. So Void Shatter fits a role. It does play a role, and with the massive counter spells in this format, I feel like there is a decent control deck based on counter spells, but Void Shatter is probably going to get passed by me a lot. I'm not a big fan of counter spells, but I will admit that this isn't just straight trash that's going to get passed around. It is playable to an extent. Alright, Prophet of Distortion. Now, this is a card I need everybody's help on. I'm not sure how good this is. Now, let's read it first. It's 1 blue for a 1/2. With Devoid, 4 mana, 1 of which is colorless. Draw a card. Again, we have a 1 mana spell, and we've already seen a couple of those, so sure, all that stuff I said about Surge applies to this as well. This one has late game utility, though. You can start drawing cards with it, and that leads me to believe that this is okay. I think the card overall is pretty weak. I don't really want to be tapping out to draw a card, but we've had cards similar to this before where we'll totally do it. Think Fathom Feeder was a fine card, and is a fine card, is still in the format. This does nothing in multiples, so I never want more than 1 of these. I feel like I can get it pretty late. I don't know how highly to take this card if I want it. There's a okay amount of draw spells already in this format, so I don't think I need this a lot, and it doesn't do anything except draw cards. It's not a very good blocker either. Against 2/1s it's fine, but it doesn't do very much outside of drawing that card, so that's really the caveat that makes me want this card if I want it at all. But overall, I'm kind of down on this right now. It's the type of card I'll have to play with and play against to see how I really feel about it. Let me know how you feel about this one, and where you think its ideal spot is in this draft format. Right, Thought Harvester is the last uncommon on this list. This is a 4 mana 2/4 flyer, so again, another efficiently costed flyer, a little clunky in certain decks, but fine, also with a little bit of weird art. But moving on, whenever you cast a colorless spell, target opponent exiles the top card of his or her library. So you kind of get this passive ability, very similar to things like Nettle Drone, but obviously not damage based. I don't think you're going to be milling your opponent very much out of the game. That is a possibility if you just draft this kind of junker deck with nothing but these and colorless spells, but it does let you get those cards into exile very easily, just casting spells. You don't have to hit with something with Ingest or use a removal spell that deals damage and exiles, so on and so forth, things like that. This just rewards you for casting spells, and again, it goes very well with the card we saw earlier that can put things back on top of your opponent's library. That being said, I think this card is okay, but I don't usually want more than one of them. I feel like there is going to be a deck, perhaps in Sealed or Draft, that plays a mass of this and does try to mill your opponent out, because it can do that, but I don't think that's going to be really the primary purpose. I think mostly when you want this card, it's because you're trying to set yourself up for the Battle for Zendikar pack and get a good processor card out of the deal. Alright, moving into the rare, and we're going to start with the Blue Oath. This one costs 3, and as with the others, it's a legendary enchantment, and I'm pretty much ignoring the Planeswalker text on here. This one lets you scry equal to the number of players you have each upkeep, or Planeswalkers you have each upkeep, which is okay, but ultimately we don't care about that in Limited. It's very, very rarely going to be relevant. What it does do, though, when it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, and then you discard 2 cards. I think this is fine. Last time I saw something like this, the exact thing, draw 3, discard 2, it was comparative analysis, or not comparative analysis, but enhanced awareness from, I think, Fate Reforged, and I thought that card was awful. It cost 5 mana, it was super clunky. It wasn't a delve format, but you know, this comes down on turn 3 and lets you kind of fix your next couple turns. It makes it so that you're probably going to hit your 4th land drop and subsequent land drops, and you kind of get to make your hand a little bit better than Brilliant Spectrum, as well, as it comes down a turn early and you don't really need all the converge shenanigans to make it work. So I think this one's a fine playable. I'd be happy to play this in my deck. There are a lot of uncommons that I would take over Oath of Jace, though. This obviously makes more of a splash in Standard, I think, where it actually works with Jace very, very well. But for Limited, I don't think it's a complete trash heap. Alright, so Hedron Alignment. Let's go ahead and zoom in on one of these. So this is very close to an unplayable rare if it weren't for the Scry one at the bottom. But what it does, if you're not aware of it, is a whole bunch of text that has no meaning in Limited. It doesn't do anything in Limited, but we'll read it for the heck of it. It is hexproof. It is a hexproof enchantment, and that is in recent memory, I can't think of any way to remove this from the battlefield. I have no idea how to remove Hedron Alignment from the battlefield with the cards that are in Battle for Zendikar. I'm drawing a blank on anything that could somehow wipe this without targeting it. But what it does is, beginning of your upkeep, if you have one, you can reveal your hand, and if you have one of these in your hand, 1 in exile, 1 on the battlefield, and 1 in your graveyard, you automatically win the game. Clearly, this being rare means that this is not going to happen in Draft or Sealed very often. If somehow you open a Sealed pool and you have 4 of these, I think you're obligated to play them. I think, yeah, there's text on here somewhere in there, in between the lines, that says you have to play all 4 of them. But the reason I don't say this is a completely dead card is because it does have that scry ability on it that is stops it from being completely irrelevant in Limited. And I know that's why the scry is there. In Constructed, that lets you dig for other ones, but there's probably better ways to scry than putting it on here. Now, that scry ability is actually fairly decent in Limited. It is a mana sink, and being able to scry and dig and dig and dig for an answer or something like that, or just dig for gas, is pretty decent. It does cost a lot, but it gives you something to do with your extra mana. Am I going to play this all the time? No. But will I play it sometimes? Probably. It's just a 2-mana or a 3-mana enchantment that says 2 mana, scry 1, and that's about it. Alright, moving on, we get a rare counter spell here. This one costs 4 and surges for 2, and it counters target spell. Also, Overwhelming Denial cannot be countered by spells or abilities itself, so it's an uncounterable counter spell, and it's literally a counterspell if you surge it. This seems awkward to me. I don't ever want to pay 4 mana for a counterspell. I know that. I don't want to sit there and not do anything on my turn unless I'm really far ahead and hold up mana to do something like this. 4 mana counterspells are pushing it for me. The problem is, I still have to hold up a bunch of mana if I want to surge it, and I have to have something else relevant to do on my opponent's turn. Now, there are times that I'm going to cast a spell on my turn, and then my opponent's going to respond, and then I'll have Surge active to counter that for 2 mana. But that's still a pretty big chunk of mana, and I have to have that double blue left open in addition to what I was doing already. I'm not going to go cast, like, Expedite and then Surge this, because my opponent's probably not going to respond to the Expedite. I'm probably going to use my follow-up for a different Surge card or something completely different I think this is a little awkward. It seems appealing. 2 mana to counter thing really does seem appealing, but you need something relevant to do in addition to it. You're not just going to sit there and hold up a bunch of different things. So my opinion is keep this for constructed. Maybe try it out, but I think it's a little bit worse than Scatter to the Winds as a rare counterspell goes, in limited at least. Alright, Deep Fathom Skulker. We're getting closer to the end here. This is a 6 mana 4/4, a little bit behind on the vanilla test, but that's kind of where blue usually is. However, we have a nice combo of abilities here. First off, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. That's any creature. So if you hit with a flyer, you're drawing a card. If you hit with 3 creatures, you're drawing 3 cards. That can put you way, way ahead. Just kind of like Biden of Thassa did during Theros draft. In addition, for 4 mana, one of which is colorless, target creature can't be blocked this turn. 2-headed giant means you can target your partner's creatures with that. But most of the time, you're going to target something. It's going to get in for damage, whether that's this creature itself or another one or multiple creatures. And you're going to draw a card for each one. This is going to be a bit of an engine, and I think it is a bomb in limited just because of how many cards it could potentially draw you. It gets you very, very far ahead. And you're in blue, so cards you're drawing are usually very relevant and are going to impact the board, whether that's advancing yours or putting your opponent behind. So I think this is a first pickable rare in almost all situations, and I'm very, very happy to see it. Alright, last rare in the set, Dimensional Infiltrator, is a 2 mana 2/1. Now, let me be honest, this thing has flying, and I noticed just a little bit earlier that it had flash, which flash on creatures just is an upgrade in addition to anything else. I guess I'll finish reading the card first. For 1 and 1 colorless, you can exile the top card of your opponent's library. If it's a land, you can bounce this thing back to your hand. The times you would want to do that is if your opponent's playing something like Boiling Earth and they're about to kill this, or if they're targeting it with removal or blocking it with something that's going to kill it, so on and so forth. Situations like that, you have the ability to put this back in your hand. Of course, you have to hit a land. It's just not any card. It does also exile cards, which is relevant, but you can also stack this ability if you want to mill multiple cards. You can stack the ability in response to itself before Infiltrator goes back to your hand. But the point is, 2 mana, 2/1 flyer is good. Flash is upside. This is upside. Vaberkin and Welkin Turn are cards that I learned very quickly that unattested, they can deal lots of damage. They come down early, and 2 damage in the air starting on turn 3 is going to slowly take away from your life total. One thing I do like about the ability here is that it works very, very well with Surge. Since this thing only costs 2, you can set up turns, multiple turns, where you play this and then cast a Surge spell, because this ability will let you bounce it back to your hand and enable further Surge spells. So I think this card is incredibly good. It doesn't look like it does, like, it doesn't look like it's going to have, like, a huge impact, but it does so many things for just 2 mana that it's efficient enough to be a rare and strong enough to play in almost every blue deck. Alright, 3 cards left. The first is Crush of Tentacles, the first blue mythic. This is where Surge is completely pushed and absolutely absurd and limited. 6 mana, return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If Crush of Tentacles Surge cost was paid, which costs 5, 1 less than the normal casting cost, you get an 8/8 blue Octopus token. Everything bounces back, you get an Octopus token. If you're playing this as a 6 mana sorcery, I think it's terrible. I hated cards like Displacement Wave. You really want mass bounce effects to be instant speed. Sorcery is just not going to do enough, because it usually means your opponent's going to get the first crack at refilling the board. However, if you're getting an 8/8 Octopus out of the deal, this becomes absolutely absurd, because your opponent has a huge threat they have to deal with. One that's not going to die to burn, one that's not going to die to a lot of the black kill spells here because they're stat reduction. Your opponent's going to be in chump mode very quickly. And can we just point out how insane this is in 2-headed giant? Your opponent casts a spell and then you get to Surge for 5. This gives you an unattested 8/8 on turn 5, which is incredible. if I draft this, I am looking to pick up Bonesaw, I'll be honest, which is awesome because the synergy this has with Bonesaw lets you bounce the Bonesaw back to your hand, using it for another Surge spell later on. First pick, in my opinion, by all means, and a card I want to draft around enough that I know I'm going to get that Octopus out of it. And then I see this thing and I have to let out a sigh because this is the type of card that I think is absurd and limited, and sometimes you're just so far ahead and you feel like you can't lose a game, and then your opponent plays dumb cards like this that are virtually unkillable, and you just no longer are winning the game. Thankfully, this guy costs 7, and what you get out of it is a 7 mana 5/5 that can't be countered, has flying and hexproof, and then makes your other instants and sorceries uncounterable. Alright, well, 5/5 hexproof means that you're not killing it with targeted removal. Flying means that 5/5 is going to be very hard to deal with, since a lot of the flyers have like 2 power or less than that in this format. You're going to have to trade multiple flyers to get this thing off the board. And if you're for some reason playing blue, counter spells, those are all suddenly dead cards. You are not countering this thing. You're not plummeting it. You're not Tears of Valakut, anything like that. You are going to have to take this thing down in combat, or you're going to have to use an Edict effect, and there aren't very many of those aside from cards like Blighted Fen. If you have this in your pool, your sealed pool, or you pull it early in draft, you're almost certainly playing blue because of how threatening the card is. Now, there are some matches where your opponent is very, very quick. They're playing a red deck, something like that, and they've got a board presence. This guy is not going to do enough. It doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield. It just is a threat that is hard to take care of. So you can go around it, and that's the best way to beat cards like this. The first card that comes to mind is Pearl Lake Ancient, which was very similar, hard to kill because of its bounce ability, but ultimately I think this is even better. From what I've read, this was made for constructed for mirror matches, control mirror matches, and that makes sense, but as a kind of an aftermath of that, we have to deal with it in limited. Thank God it's mythic. We do not have to deal with it that often. I hate playing against cards like this. They are terrible to deal with, and they will win you the game a lot. Alright, and I actually have one more card to show here. It's kind of my sleeper hit, and it's my vote for best card in the whole format. Best card in Oath of the Gatewatch. I think people are going to... I think this is going to be a little bit controversial, but let me make my case. And I think it's going to be underrated at first, but let's look at it. Definitely the best card in Oath of the Gatewatch. Ancient Crab. Alright, can we just take a second to look at this? Alright, done. Look at that. Look at that cost, and look at that power and toughness. That is insane. This is clearly vintage playable. This is the most pushed thing I've ever seen in my life. Look at that effect. That is absurd. And creature type could not be more relevant. How many crab tribal decks could this fit into, right? Absolutely absurd. Double blue. For this mana cost, I could be casting, relevant things, but this just comes down and it does so much for its mana cost. I think it's insane. First pickable out of all the blue cards, this is definitely the best thing I've seen here. I have nothing else to say about Ancient Crab. I think I've made my case, but there you go. Let's stop looking at it. Okay, yeah, there we go. That looks better. All right. Yeah. So sorry, I had to have some fun with that one. Anyway, blue looks very good. Blue is already, I think, unanimously voted as the best color in Battle for Zendikar, and I think the blue cards here, especially the Surge cards, give it kind of a run for its money. I think they're going to meld well. They're going to support the archetypes that already exist in Battle for Zendikar, and they're going to build on those while also kind of giving more tempo options. Blue-red is going to be a deck, and it is going to be a very good deck in my opinion. It's just going to do some powerful things a lot earlier than the opponent can, and I look forward to drafting it. I think it's going to be very, very fun. Usually blue-red is like an artifact theme, but here we get kind of a more aggressive kind of a tempo-y type build out of blue-red, and I think that's great. Let me know what you think of the blue... Oh, God, sorry. Let me know what you think of the blue cards here, and let me know what your favorite card is, and I hope you draft a Sphinx of the Final Word and win the game. Alright, I'll be back. I've still got black cards and green cards to deal with. I'll probably be doing those videos tomorrow, though. So thank you all for watching. Leave some comments, some likes, some subscribe, leave some love, and I will be back with another video shortly. Alright, thank you guys.